Hello, I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcasts. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Yonit. It's it's a kind of somber hello today, isn't it? I mean, the world is in a dark place, it feels. So it's hard to be super cheery. I'm guessing you're just absolutely run ragged, broadcasting news all hours and on the air all the time to a waiting Israeli nation.
Yeah, I walking here around the newsroom, and you see these televisions in all kinds of languages from all kinds of places in the world that all have the same Chiron war in Europe, and it really, as you said, it's not a good mood day, right? It does make you feel concerned and despondent, and we've been through this 2 years of COVID and in being immersed in the R and the infection rates and it kind of, now that the fifth wave is waning, we actually realize that what humans can do to humans is always worse than anything else. We don't need viruses. We don't need pandemics. It's just back to this. And that's very depressing.
Yeah, I know lots of people have been feeling this, that one way or another, when is the news going to stop? When is history going to give us a break? There's too much history happening. And it was like, okay, we've got out of a global pandemic. Before that, the world was, parts of it anyway, trembling at the prospect of Donald Trump as president and just wanting a kind of breather. And remember, it was the big promise of Joe Biden that there would be a return to normality. And instead, as you say, a really history-making event. I mean, obviously, there has been war in Europe since 1945 in the Balkans in the 1990s. But this already is going to be and threatens to be bigger and more devastating. And, I had a text message from a journalist colleague saying, we're due to meet next week, World War III permitting. And, it's that kind of black humor, gallows humor that journalists specialize in. But there is something of that mood going on in the world. And it's just, it's one of those days, as you and I speak, it's the invasion of Ukraine is only a few hours old. But it was one of those days where you wake up with that very kind of heavy feeling because there's that split second before you remember, just as you emerge out of unconsciousness and then it comes back to you. And this was one of those mornings where it was a very heavy feeling. So we're going to talk about that a bit. And obviously, given who
you're
we
British,
are
so when you mean a bit, you mean a lot, right?
A lot. I mean,
okay.
I'm interested in how this looks from where you are, because Israel is in a quite unique place on this.
Indeed. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, but also I'm thinking about the fact that this whole thing is happening, right, in an open air arena, right, when the whole world is watching. And you're seeing one country being attacked by another country. And no one is coming, essentially, to the rescue, right? I mean, what you're seeing is, yes, we'll close down their bank accounts, but you're not seeing, and I know this is really naive to say, but everyone is watching this, and no one is helping Ukraine. Now, I'm the last person in the world that can say to any other country, send troops, right? Or the IDF should send Israeli forces to help Ukraine. But just that feeling, what message does this send everywhere? What message does it send to countries like Iran or to countries like China? What message does every country in the world get today, which is only we can protect ourselves, right? It could ignite this arms race that we're not even realizing. And that was me trying to lighten the Shabbat mood. So I will go on to answer what you were talking about.
Well, no, just before you do, though, I mean, I think you're saying something really important. Britain's former Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, who's now in New York working for the International Rescue Committee, working for on refugee problems and the like, he made a very important speech a while back talking about the age of impunity, and that we're now in an age of impunity where, bad regimes can do terrible things and know that pretty well they will get away with it. And there is obviously a connection here between what's happened and what has not happened in recent years, that what we're witnessing is the price of inaction. And Garry Kasparov, who besides being a former chess champion is also a kind of a focus of political dissent in Russia, has said that this is the price for the amnesia of the Western world. And he was saying, it was Chechnya 20 years ago, it was Crimea in 2014, it's been Syria the whole of the last decade. What more warning did you need from Vladimir Putin to take this guy seriously and to realize he means business. And huge amounts of the debates in our world since Iraq were always about the price of intervention, the risks of intervention. Well, there are risks of non-intervention and inaction too. And the world didn't act in those other cases, and therefore look at what we have to deal with instead.
I think exactly. I mean, does avoiding war at all costs actually indeed cause less war or more war? And what is left of this idea of the West, right? Of this idea, if someone attacks you unprovoked, right? No one's going to come in and help you. I mean, it leaves a lot of open and very troubling questions. And again, we're just at the beginning of this, so we don't know where this will lead. And I've heard a very smart Israeli analyst who I spoke to and kind of telling me that Putin is this kind of man that doesn't have the exact A to B to C, right? He thinks this is the way, but actually every step he makes opens up 10 possibilities for him, and that is how he moves forward. So we don't know what the end game of this is. Now, you started talking about Israel, and I think it's important to kind of reiterate, we talked about this a few episodes ago, and say that Israel is, of course, in a bit of a delicate situation here, right? On the one hand, of course, the United States is our staunchest ally. We know this, and we know who we get $3.8 billion from every year. But obviously, because of the connection and the fact that Russia is in Syria, and because Israel needs to act against Iranian targets and other targets inside Syria, it needs Russia. It needs Russia in the everything that is connected to the Iran deal, which we will relate to later. So it is walking a very tight rope, and you saw two different responses. Yesterday, Israel was talking about the importance of the sovereignty of Ukraine without mentioning the word Russia. Today,
I saw that statement, extraordinary, an official foreign ministry statement.
Yeah, it took 2 days to actually phrase that. They worked on it for 2 days to say that.
And it omitted the word Russia.
It didn't say the word. It said it's respected Ukraine's integrity and sovereignty. But today, it's already a much more strict condemnation of Russia itself, coming from the words from the mouth of Yair Lapid, the foreign minister. So we have stepped up. I think Israel has realized that it can't kind of stay on the sidelines of this. I spoke to an American official yesterday because I wanted to kind of see how this is landing in the United States. And he said to me, Israel suddenly realizes it's Switzerland, which is a very, very, this is laden with meaning, because we know that Switzerland was obviously infamously neutral when it counted in World War II. So suddenly Israel is neutral. That is not it doesn't fall in a good way in the
that is scathing, isn't it? I mean, if Washington is regarding Israel as the Switzerland of this situation, and as we've been saying, a moral situation, this is a moral crisis among beyond just being a geopolitical crisis, that is really damning if Washington does regard Israel that way. And I'm interested to know whether Israelis themselves are saying, we don't want to be Switzerland. We can't be neutral in a situation like this.
I think that the time has passed on that. I mean, the sense that I'm getting here is that we are moving more and more towards not being on the fence. We could maybe do that as long as there wasn't actually an invasion. But the minute this happens, then we have to choose sides. It's obvious what side the Israelis will choose. But again, these are layers, right? So first, there's a condemnation. Then we will see something in the UN that Israel will sign, I assume. And then you'll see sanctions against specific people. Then Israel will have to decide what it's doing. So this is going to go on for a while, but I think that the patience is not there anymore in the U.S. administration.
We should explain to our new listeners, who we hope are joining us as each week goes on, why it is that Israel is unable or feels reticent to join the immediate, bandwagon of countries condemning Russia, why it feels the need to have had that neutral posture, albeit that you're saying that is now under revision. Because we've talked about it before on the podcast, but I think it'll be useful for people coming to this conversation afresh. There are some very interesting reasons why Israel can't just say, no, Mr. Putin? And I think, you should refresh our memory on that.
Well, first and foremost, Israel needs Putin's goodwill so it can act with a free hand in Syria, where it attacks Iranian targets and Hezbollah targets and arms shipments to Hezbollah. These are Israel's worst enemies, and they are on the border because of Iranian presence in Syria. So it needs an open way of acting in Syria. That is the most important thing. And it needs Russia on its side the same way that it needs the United States on its side in the negotiations across the table from Iran and Vienna, which are, by the way, remarkably still happening, right? We will talk about that in a minute, this sort of balance between the United States and Russia being at odds here in Ukraine, but actually still in the same negotiating table in Vienna. So yes, Israel needs Russia strategically. There's no love lost there. I called it, when we talked about it last time, I said Israel is stuck between the United States and Russia is between a dad and an angry stepdad. It's not that we don't know where at the end of the day the chips will fall, but it is a difficult dilemma. And when you see, Jonathan, something like the condemnation that Israel voiced today, directly condemning Russia for the first time since 2008, that was the Georgian crisis, we know that someone in the Kremlin is writing this down, right? We have no doubt about that, but that is just the way it's going to be. The more this intensifies, the more it becomes complicated. Israel is going to have to choose a side. It is choosing a side.
You said earlier that, about this notion of inaction, that the world is doing so little, almost nothing for Ukraine. And on one level, that is really obviously true. There's some discussion about sending arms to Ukraine. Germany brought down a lot of mockery on its head when it offered, or did send, 5,000 protective helmets to Ukraine. But,
maybe it gained the respect back with the decision with Nord Stream 2. Right?
Absolutely it did, because that was a more fierce sanction. But in a way, in that move, the Germany move, you get a good grasp of the range of responses, because military response, not so much. We're not going to do much. Here's a few protective helmets. But instead, the way we're going to respond to this is economic. And Germany's decision to halt, we don't know if it's fully cancelled, but for now, suspend progress on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline is obviously in that direction. Boris Johnson here in London has made an announcement also saying that there will be an economic response, although interestingly saying this operation will have to fail militarily as well. Didn't say how that would happen. But what it brings out to me is the kind of powerlessness Western nations, if you like, have when faced with this kind of threat. Because the obvious option is this economic response, sanctions. And yet, where is the example of those succeeding in a situation like this? Because you look at Iran, you look at the Assad regime in Syria, there have been economic sanctions against those regimes, and they haven't really made a difference. Assad is still there. The regime in Iran,
it brought them to the negotiating table.
It brought them to the negotiating table.
It was pressure for something. But
in a situation where the leader in charge is not that bothered by the impact of even crippling economic sanctions on his own people, that is pretty difficult, because it's not that much of a stick if he doesn't care if it beats his own people. Sure. On the other hand, hard power, nobody is really talking about that. And one very sobering thing I heard from a British military official was that nuclear thinking, his phrase, nuclear thinking is part of Russia's strategy. In other words, the nuclear deterrent isn't some remote, abstract, never behind glass, never to be broken. But on the contrary, as when they game out all their different options, the nuclear element of their arsenal is part of their thinking. For that reason alone, no one is going to dare tangle with the Russians. And you look at the United States, which has the greatest arsenal in history, let alone in the planet now. No military arsenal like that has ever been assembled, and yet it can't use it. It has all this hard power, but obviously it can't use it because of that possibility. And so that adds to this terrible feeling of powerlessness. I don't think people are wanting to do nothing for Ukraine, but you look at the toolbox and there's not that much there that you can be sure will work. And of course it will be economic and we hope it will work, but there's not a ton of options.
Yes, but look what the world has gone through in these decades since the end of the Second World War. Whoever wants an example of why not to intervene, you have enough. You have Iraq, you have other places that are an example of what happens when you try and you fail. I just don't think it means that you never need to try again. And in specific cases like this one, I think leaders around the world should ask themselves, what is it that we're doing? Yes, maybe economic sanctions at the beginning, maybe sanctions around Putin's own oligarchs is important. Maybe that will make a difference, and we can talk about that. But if not, then what? And I think that the world is not really come together and thought about that question.
David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, who was with us last week, slightly, smiled as he mentioned the local angle and our search for the local angle, which we've been doing a bit by talking about Israel. The other element, of course, is there are Jews in Kiev, Jews in Ukraine. Historically, Ashkenazi Jews do feel a connection with that place. There have been a few interesting commentary pieces written by people whose parents or grandparents were from there. But there is still a community there of some 20,000 people. And they're, reportedly bracing for the same shortages, food shortages, etc., that the rest of Ukrainian nation will be bracing for. But one interesting thing, which I think maybe hasn't been sort of thought about that much, is also the fear of, as they put it, anti-Semitic provocations to delegitimize the regime in Kiev. What do they mean by that? It's an odd thing, but notice the rhetoric that Vladimir Putin is using at the moment, and that is that we will not stop until we've achieved the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And this goes to something that a drum he has been banging since the Maidan protests and revolution in 2013, 2014. This notion that the government in Kiev, the anti-Russian or Putin-skeptic government in Kiev, was somehow overrun with neo-Nazis and anti-Semites. And therefore there has been a constant attempt to talk up or even often exaggerate or even invent anti-Jewish attacks or speech or violence in Ukraine to say, see, these are the Nazis who are running Ukraine. This is why we have to go in there and restore or impose a better regime. Once again, there are Jews there who are worried for their own safety, but oddly, the Jewish history, the Jewish experience is part of this story. Because it's a useful tool for Vladimir Putin to tap into that World War II era notion that there is heroic Russia fighting against fascism in Europe.
And isn't it making it a hard sell, the fact that the President Zelensky of Ukraine is Jewish? That's not at all a hard sell for him. I guess not.
I mean, they have to say, so cunning are the racist anti-Semite neo-Nazis in Ukraine that they have handed the presidency and the prime minister's office to the Jews. I mean, it's obviously a crazy line of logic, but it is the argument. So there is, as I say, I think it's not just a parochial concern. I think it is part of the rhetorical war, the kind of propaganda war. Jews find themselves caught in that particular place in the middle on that one.
Yeah, here it is. Obviously there's a huge Russian community, Russian immigrants, a million, maybe even more, obviously, and Russians and Ukrainians living here together, and now their families are fighting each other. It's a very strange situation. And of course, there are Russian oligarchs in Israel coming here under the law of return. By the way, not only pro-Putin oligarchs, you have the anti-Putin oligarchs like Leonid Nevzlin here as well, and questions about people like Roman Abramovich. I can tell you that I saw a letter written to the American ambassador here, Tom Knights, asking, several Israeli groups asking for I think a consideration if anyone will use sanctions against Roman Abramovich, saying he's a philanthropist, he's an Israeli, he helps Israeli institutions. So this is also going to be an issue definitely in the UK in the next couple of days, for sure.
Well, you've heard the phrase Londongrad, that London has been this place for a decade or more where serious Russian money has gathered, and plenty of oligarchs here. And the suggestion is made, because there are quite a lot of high-value Russian donors to the ruling Conservative Party in this country. And so the suggestion is made that, therefore, there will be some appetite to go a bit soft on economic sanctions or make exemptions, because there's a lot of Russian money here, and there's people who powerfully are able perhaps to bend the ear of the authorities. That's been an issue here. I'm fascinated to know because we know there are some oligarchs gathered in Israel, I mean, big numbers, or, well, you'll tell me if they're big numbers, but they are there, whether they too are either accused of, or in your view actually are, bending the ear of either Netanyahu before or Bennett now to say, hands off Russia. Don't go after Putin.
It's a different kind of relationship, because first of all, the political contributions you can give as an oligarch in this country are much smaller, and most Israeli politicians don't need it. They have their own funding. So that's not an issue here of having the ear of. But obviously, as I said, there are oligarchs here on both sides, the pro-Putin and the anti-Putin side. I should make note, Jonathan, that also a lot of Jewish organizations in Israel and around the world might be in a bit of a problem if you start to sanction Russian oligarchs. This is going to affect everyone around the world for all kinds of reasons that we don't even see now. Someone reminded me yesterday that the prices of wheat are going to go up dramatically because of this war, and that means all around the world, bread prices are going to go up. I live in a region where if you just raise the prices in 5 cents, there's going to be, and there was already, mayhem. So that is going to affect everyone around the world in some ways that we don't even know about.
And right now, I mean, what's strange is the way the world can turn on a dime, where everyone is obsessed about COVID or, the global issue. And then suddenly the entire global community is focused, as it rightly should be, on Ukraine. Nevertheless, geopolitics never rests and never stops. And there are developments in which have a huge bearing on the Middle East that are going on, as it were, despite all this. And in a way, I find it very interesting that they're even happening now. And I've got a little theory that maybe actually they could almost perversely be helped by what's going on now. But anyway, you tell us what's going on, because you're the one who's in the know.
Right. So we are talking about the Iran deal and the discussions around the Iran deal in Vienna that are still going on, right? Which means that the Russians and the Americans are in the same side, and you have Rob Malley as the American envoy and Ulyanov as the Russian envoy discussing this. We actually thought that a deal is very much imminent this week. And there was actually 20 pages of a draft that were leaked to Reuters, and we kind of saw what the deal would be. So this is going on, as you say, geopolitics don't stop. This is going on parallel to what is happening in Russia at the same time. I spoke to an Israeli official yesterday who said to me, if only the United States would threaten Iran with the same credibility and force that they're threatening Russia, we'd be in a different place. So Israel is concerned about this, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But that is what is going on at the same time.
It's a fascinating illustration of how the world is capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. Normally, when a huge global event goes on like this, where the whole world's attention's on one thing, that is usually a reason to worry, because it can mean that bad people do bad things when the rest of the world is distracted, when their attention is elsewhere. And there are examples of that. In fact, it even happened in the first wave of COVID. All kinds of regimes got away with things because while no one was looking. So you'd be worried about, what Kim Jong-un is thinking right now, or China, what they think they can get away with. There can be, though, very unusually, a slight upside, which is if people want to make diplomatic concessions that would normally exact a price in terms of domestic politics or bad coverage or bad PR, now is the moment they would do that. There was a British spin doctor in British politics nearly 20 years ago who got fired because during 9/11 they sent a memo to colleagues saying today is a good day to bury bad news. And, this was seen as so cynical that she paid with her job. But in a way, if the Biden administration, if Rob Malley and the others need to do something that's a bit tricky, now might be the time. On the other hand, if there's some kind of linkage where Russia says we're not going to give our blessing to this or that move with Iran unless you go easier on us in terms of Ukraine, well, that, of course, would be very bad.
Yep. We don't know how much of of what is happening in Ukraine is percolating in that room in Vienna. We do know that the discussions are still ongoing. We know that Israel is very worried about it, right? It was promised a longer and stronger agreement, and it's now calling it a shorter and a weaker agreement. But I think there are many parts, even in Israel's security echelon, that would at least breathe a sigh of relief and say, if we have 2 years and a half in which this is under some sort of supervision, it's better than nothing. And again, remember, this comes on the cusp of the deal that existed and that Trump tore up with the encouragement of Benjamin Netanyahu. So it will give the world some sort of respite. Israel is very concerned about this, but for now, it's still going strong. The discussions are still happening. They haven't blown up yet.
Which is really something, and will be, a feather in the cap of the Biden administration, just purely in terms of, capability, because very often even the, White House, the presidency of the United States, often it does struggle to walk and chew gum at the same time. Often there isn't enough capacity to deal with more than one problem.
And you started by saying that their promise was return to normalcy. I think their promise with regards to, or their promise to themselves, right, the Biden administration, they wanted to pivot to China, right? That was the whole plan. Where is that now? Now they're dealing with Iran again, with Russia again. This is not, I think, what they had planned to be doing in 2022.
Isn't the pivot to China, it's slightly waiting for Godot, isn't it? It is one of those things that every administration... I am so ancient that I did actually cover the first term of the first Clinton administration back in the early 90s. And there they were talking about the pivot to Asia, the pivot to, to China. And each time events intervene and somehow it gets...
I thought you were going to say, I was so ancient, I remember sitting with Mao Zedong and he said to me, Jonathan...
Very nice, Yoni. Thank you for suggesting I might be even older than I had previously been prepared to admit. As it happens, I didn't cover the early years of the Mao administration. But there are days when I feel
not the Cultural Revolution, not anything like that.
I should have done. We have Chutzpah and Mensch to distribute our weekly awards. Mm-hmm. And I think you're going first, aren't you, with Chutzpah?
I will. Go surprise, I'm doing the Chutzpah this week. I will take you back, my friend, to the 2014 year in Israel where Benjamin Netanyahu is still prime minister. And he decides, and he later admitted to this, basically dismantle his coalition and go to the 2015 elections because of a law. The law was called Chok Yisrael Hayom. It was a law that was supposed to hurt the revenues of a newspaper that was then considered to be Netanyahu's mouthpiece. Yisrael Hayom is a newspaper that was founded by billionaire Sheldon Adelson in 2007, and again, considered by many Israelis to be Netanyahu's mouthpiece. We are fast-forwarding to the year 2022. Benjamin Netanyahu is no longer prime minister. Miriam Adelson, the now widow of Sheldon Adelson, is the publisher of Yisrael Hayom, and she has actually pivoted the newspaper less to Netanyahu and more to other political figures. By the way, last week there was an op-ed against Netanyahu in the newspaper. The whole country talked about it. And now, lo and behold, the Likud, still under Benjamin Netanyahu, wants to bring forth a law that will, yes, you guessed it, curtail the revenues of Yisrael Hayom. So I think that is a bit of a chutzpah, just when you think about the whole circle that this thing has gone through. It's kind of a different law. It has to deal with other things, but the bottom line is still hurting the revenues of Yisrael Hayom. So I think they objected to it, now they support it.
It's an egregious act of chutzpah, which is, we have one rule when you're on our side, and then suddenly we discover a whole different rule when you're on the other side. No, I think that is right in the dictionary definition of chutzpah. For Mensch, I initially was thinking that I wanted to nominate the ambassador of Kenya, Martin Kimani, ambassador to the United Nations, who gave a really great speech at the meeting of the Security Council earlier this week, making the case as the representative of a once colonized nation in defense of Ukraine. And it's quite rare you make that connection is made between what colonialization or imperialism in Africa and imperialism at the hands of Vladimir Putin. And he did it very subtly, but just made a speech that essentially said, we know all about being invaded or being others taking control of our destiny, and this is bad. So he was an initial choice, but I think given everything that's happened, I think we would want to make special mention of Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine at this moment, not just for the symbolism of what his nation is going through, but very specifically for a speech he made in late Wednesday night to his nation. I really think it was a speech for the ages. I think it's a speech that will be quoted in years to come, where he tries to not just gird the people of Ukraine for what's coming, but actually addresses Russian people themselves and says in Russian that we are a people too. And he says, they're telling you that addressing the Russians, they're telling you that this flame will liberate the people of Ukraine, but the Ukrainian people are free. They remember their past and are building their future. Ukraine on your TV news and the real Ukraine are two totally different countries. Ours is real. And it's an amazing sort of plea. Yeah. I recommend people go and find the English text of it. It's a very moving speech addressing Russians. Lots of you have relatives in Ukraine, he says. You studied in Ukrainian universities. You have Ukrainian friends. You know our character. You know what matters to us. Listen to yourselves. The people of Ukraine want peace. I found it exceptionally moving to read it. I think Volodymyr Zelensky, who knows what's going to happen with him as an individual? Is he going to be the president in exile eventually? All kinds of awful things are possible. But this week, I think he's a standout figure, and I think we want to recognize that.
So before we go, we do have to mention these are very tense times, but we do want to lighten the mood a little bit and say that on this day, right, 25th of February, two great Englishmen were born. I'm assuming many others, but we will point out the fact that George Harrison was born on this date, sadly not with us anymore. And Jonathan Friedland was born on this day. This is very exciting.
It is true. Thank you so much for remembering. It is very exciting. Just persisting with what has a regular theme of our podcast, which is how I'm getting
embarrassing
older.
you?
I thought
about me embarrassing you, which is a persistent theme of our podcast.
That is a theme, and my aging is a little theme too. But yes, I do like birthdays. My late father used to think that one birthday was not enough, and there should be 3 days. And he took his lead from the Christmas festival and thought there should be birthday Eve, birthday, and then birthday Boxing Day. So I'm merely at the beginning of these festivities, Yonit.
I think it's nice. Since I'm like mentally and emotionally about 55 years older than you, I think that I can, as from my life experience. I'm kidding. But no, seriously, we should share with our listeners that I sent you a package, which arrived on Tuesday. By the time they hear this podcast, you will have already opened it. But on Tuesday, you just wrote to me and said that the parcel has arrived.
A lovely looking parcel. I said a lovely big parcel has arrived.
I think maybe the word lovely wasn't there, but doesn't matter. And then you went on to 24-hour silence on WhatsApp, which I assumed meant you opened the present and you hated it. And then I asked you 24 hours later, what gives? Like, what's with the present? Why did you hate it? And then you said that you hadn't opened it yet.
Yeah.
Because
it was so funny, and it struck me as such a beautifully Jewish moment because it was a variation on the Jewish mother who gives the son the red tie and the blue tie. And of course, he turns up for Shabbos dinner the next week with the blue tie. And she goes, so you hated the red tie? And there was something in here because, of course, I hadn't opened it. And I messaged you to say, what kind of barbarian do you think I am that would, when your birthday's on a Friday, who opens the present on the Tuesday? So, of course,
people who have trouble waiting and want to get the present now. Okay, I will. This is
you saying you're 55 years older than me. Is it possible that this is a very young side to your need that thinks the minute the present's there, it should be ripped?
You just open it. Well, I'm just saying that you'll probably, whatever. It's a present for you. That's the only thing. I'm not going to spoil it because you haven't opened it yet, but it's a present for you. Like you can't hand it down to anyone else.
No, and I won't do. I'm so
like you may have
excited
done with the T-shirt I gave you. I'm just saying. There's a lot of guilt trip going on here.
It is conceivable that the T-shirt might have been for a more svelte and younger man. It is possible, but this one is already, it's there. I've got pleasure from it all week because it's sat there, this lovely big box with your handwritten label on it, and I'm waiting for the moment of opening it. And we will have to share with listeners, of course, what was inside it next week. But the listeners, I'm convinced, we'll find out if this is an Israeli thing or a Jewish thing or a British thing. I want to hear from our listeners whether this is just a me thing that you think you have to wait, of course, or whether you are not barbarians and you agree with me that if you get a birthday present, you open it on your birthday. I think that's the law almost. I was quite shocked by this alternative approach from my co-host, but I'm also extremely grateful, and I'm very, very excited about it and looking forward to it. So
and please send your responses to unholy@keshet-tv.com. Jonathan, have the best birthday, have fun, and we will talk next week, and we will say our thank yous to Lior Friedman and Rom Atik and Omer Primat and Irad Eshel, and of course a very big thank you to Richard Myron, and we will talk next week and you will share your birthday experiences.
I will indeed. And if you've enjoyed it, do write and rate and review and spread the word and otherwise spread the love. So thank you very much and see you next week, Yonit.
See you.